7,000 people were packed into a stone church when the doors came apart, and the men who came through them were already slick to the elbow. They went down the rows the way you'd scythe a field, opening throats, splitting skulls, the floor going slippery underfoot, so the killers had to brace themselves against the pillars to keep swinging. Children were trampled into the wet stone by the crush of their own mothers trying to climb the walls. The priest at the altar was cut down, still holding the cup, and when there was nothing left in there moving, the soldiers set the roof alight and walked out, and the screaming went on for a while from inside the fire before it stopped. That was one building. Others burned the same way. By the end of that afternoon, the whole town of Béziers was a furnace with people still alive in it, and the thing that set it all off, the spark under all that horror, was one man going off a bridge. He was a single crusader, caught in a scuffle on the one stone bridge crossing the River Orbe outside the walls, and the townspeople hacked him down and pitched him over the side into the water. The men who saw it stood at the very bottom of the whole army, the camp servants, the barefoot ones who carried the bags and dug the latrines and ate last when there was anything left to eat. The ones nobody gave orders to. They watched their man go into the river, and something in them broke loose, and they swarmed the walls with whatever they had in their fists, and inside of 2 hours, every one of those churches was on fire. Before we go any deeper into that, though, let me say hello properly. Welcome in, and thank you for being here. If you get something out of these, the subscribe button genuinely does help more than you'd think, and a real sincere thank you to everyone supporting the channel and keeping the lights on so I can keep making them. One quick thing before we go further in. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel, what towns and countries and time zones you're all tuning in from, so tell me down below. All right. Béziers. The summer of 1209. To make sense of why an army of northern Frenchmen was standing outside a southern French town in the first place, you have to know what these people had been called. Heretics. The south of France in those years, the region they called the Languedoc, was a different world from the kingdom up north. They spoke a different language down there, Occitan, the tongue of the troubadours and the love songs. They looked towards Spain and Catalonia for their culture and their trade more than they ever looked toward distant Paris. And among them, woven quietly into the towns and the villages, living next door to ordinary Catholics, was a faith the Catholic Church found completely unbearable. We call them the Cathars now, though that word came later and they probably wouldn't have recognized it. They believed the world was split between two powers, a good God of light and spirit, and an evil one who had made all of this material mess we live in, the flesh, the dirt, the body, the whole rotting physical world. They thought human souls were little fragments of trapped light, divine sparks caught inside corruptible bodies, doomed to be reborn again and again, life after life, until they finally renounced the world entirely and escaped it. Their holy ones, the perfecti, the perfects, lived like the living renunciation of everything the medieval church had become. No meat, no sex, no property, no wealth. They wandered, they preached, they ate almost nothing, and they gave a single blessing, the consolamentum, a laying on of hands, usually administered to the dying because it demanded a purity almost no living person could keep up. A believer would spend a whole ordinary life as a credence, a sympathizer, married, working, eating normally, and then on the deathbed receive the one sacrament that, in their belief, freed the soul from the wheel of rebirth at last. Some of the dying who took it then refused all food and water afterward, to die in their new purity before they could fall back into sin, a practice the credentes treated as holy and the Church treated as proof of how monstrous the whole thing was. To people in the Languedoc who looked at the rich, comfortable, land-holding Catholic clergy and then looked at these threadbare perfecti who owned nothing and wanted nothing, the appeal was obvious. These were holy people who actually lived the way holy people were supposed to live. And that, more than any fine point of doctrine about good gods and evil gods, was the thing the Church could not tolerate, because it made the Church itself look corrupt by comparison. Rome had been trying to argue these people back into the fold for decades, sending preachers, sending whole campaigns of holy men, sending future saints practically, and getting nowhere. The South just absorbed them and went on as before. And then in January of 1208, a papal legate named Pierre de Castelnau was murdered, struck down near the Rhône after a furious quarrel with the Count of Toulouse, and Pope Innocent III had finally had enough. He called a crusade, not against Muslims in some faraway land across the sea, against Christians in southern France, against towns full of baptized Catholics who happened to be living alongside heretics, against neighbors. He offered the same spiritual rewards as a crusade to the Holy Land, the same wiping clean of sins, and he offered something else that got everyone's attention, the lands of the heretics, and those who sheltered them, free for the taking by whoever came to fight. And the terms were generous in a way that made the whole thing irresistible to a certain kind of younger son. 40 days of service, just 40 days in the field, and you earned the full indulgence. The same one you'd get for marching all the way to Jerusalem and back, with all the danger and expense that involved. 40 days in the warm and wealthy South, against your own neighbors, for the same reward as years in the desert. Men came in their thousands. The army that gathered at Lyon in the early summer of 1209 was a strange and dangerous beast. Knights from the north who wanted land and glory and forgiveness. Mercenary bands, professional killers with no faith but their pay. Pilgrims who'd genuinely taken the cross for their souls. And trailing behind all of them, that great shapeless mass of poor servants and hangers-on, the people the chroniclers call the ribots or the ribalds, the unarmed underclass of any medieval army, the ones who did the filthy work and got none of the credit. At the head of the whole thing, spiritually at least, rode a Cistercian abbot named Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Citeaux, a man whose name you'll want to hold on to, because what he said and what he wrote in the days ahead has echoed for 800 years and shows no sign of stopping. They marched south, and the local lords started doing the arithmetic of survival. Raymond VI, the Count of Toulouse, the biggest fish in the entire region, read the wind early and switched sides, joining the Crusaders to save his own skin and his own lands and his own neck. But his nephew, a young man of just 24 named Raymond Roger Trencavel, the Viscount who held both Béziers and Carcassonne, tried to submit and was turned away cold at Montpellier. So he did the only thing left to a man in his position. He rode hard for Carcassonne to prepare its defences, and on the way he stopped at Béziers and stood before its people and told them, more or less, "Hold out, defend yourselves, I'll come back for you." He took some of the Cathars away with him, and the town's Jewish families too, and then he rode off into the July heat and left the rest of them to it. The people of Béziers were not afraid, and the days right before stay with me for exactly that reason. They had high walls, they sat up on good defensible ground above the river, they were well stocked with food and with water, and they had a very reasonable theory about what was coming, which was that a giant army cannot feed itself forever in one place, that it eats through the countryside around it and then starts to starve and rot and quarrel, and that all they really had to do was wait a couple of weeks for hunger and boredom and disease to break the siege apart from the inside. They had survived sieges before. They fully expected to survive this one too. Confidence in their position was not foolish. It just turned out to be wrong. Their own bishop tried to save them before any of it began. Renaud de Montpellier came into the town carrying a list. 222 names written out one by one, mostly the known Cathars and a few others, the leaders, the perfecti, the heads of the community. That list actually survives, which is a strange and chilling thing to know, that we can still read the names that were supposed to be traded for a city. His offer to the townspeople was simple and merciless. Hand over these 222 people, and the rest of you live. The whole town gathered in the cathedral to talk it over, Catholic and Cathar together, and they made their decision, and the decision was no. These were their people, their relatives, their friends, their merchants and weavers and bakers and neighbors. You do not round up 200 of your own and hand them over to be burned to buy yourself one quiet afternoon. Think about the arithmetic of that choice from inside the cathedral, with the army already in sight. The list was not long. 222 names against a whole town of thousands. Anyone doing the cold math would have handed them over and saved everyone else. And the people of Béziers, standing in their church, looked at that math and refused it because some of the names were their own families, and because they did not believe, even then, that the alternative would actually be the death of the entire town. They were wrong about the second part. The bishop, seeing exactly how it would go, then asked at least the Catholics to come out with him and save themselves, to abandon the heretics to their fate. And they said no to that too. They would stay. So the bishop left, with only a small handful of people willing to follow him out, and behind him the gates of Béziers swung shut. July the 22nd. The feast day of Mary Magdalene, of all days. The Crusaders were still getting settled outside the walls, still days away from anything like a proper organized assault, tents going up, the great army sprawling out along the riverbank in the heat. And the people of Béziers, confident, maybe drunk on their own confidence, started taunting them, shouting insults down from the walls, sending out little raiding parties to needle and harass the camp. One of those sorties spilled out onto the bridge over the Orb, and that's where the crusader was caught and killed and thrown over the side into the water. And that's the moment the Ribaults lost their minds entirely. Here is what Arnaud Amalric himself wrote to the Pope afterward, and I want you to really sit with the fact that this is the legate's own account, in his own voice, written to his own master in Rome, not some bitter rumour spread by his enemies. He wrote that while the barons were still standing around discussing what to do about the Catholics trapped inside the city, the servants and the other people of low rank, the unarmed ones, attacked the city without waiting for any orders from their leaders at all. To our amazement, he says, to our amazement, crying out, to arms, within the space of just 2 or 3 hours, they crossed the ditches and they crossed the walls, and Béziers was taken. And then he writes the line that history remembers. Our men spared no one, he says, irrespective of rank or sex or age, and put to the sword almost 20,000 people. After this great slaughter, the whole city was despoiled and burnt, as divine vengeance miraculously raged against it. Divine vengeance. He's pleased about it. You can feel the satisfaction sitting there on the page, the sense that something holy and correct has been accomplished. The most famous sentence attached to this whole episode, though, he probably never actually said. You've almost certainly heard it before. The story goes that as the killing started, the soldiers came to the abbot in the chaos and asked him how on earth they were supposed to tell the good Catholics apart from the heretics, since they all looked the same, dressed the same, screamed the same, bled the same. And Amalric is supposed to have answered, "Kill them all, God will know his own." In the Latin, caedite eos, novit enim dominus qui sunt eius. It is a stunning, terrible, perfect line. It is also reported by a completely different monk, a man named Caesarius of Heisterbach, writing years and years later, and even he hedged it. Even he wrote that the abbot was reported to have said this, not that he definitely said it. So the honest position is that we don't really know. Most historians lean toward it being a story that grew up around the event afterward, rather than a quote anyone wrote down at the time. But you can see exactly why it stuck, and why it spread, and why it refuses to die. The speed of the killing, the total blank indifference to who actually died, the burning of the entire town down to the ground. None of that needs the famous quote to be true in order to be horrifying. The quote just gives a voice to something that was already loose in the streets that afternoon. And the streets were the worst of it. People ran for the churches, the way people always did, the way it had always worked before in living memory. Sanctuary, holy ground. You fled to the altar, and the killing was supposed to stop at the threshold, because even hardened soldiers feared the sin of spilling blood on consecrated stone. That church I started with, the one with the doors coming apart, was the Church of the Madeleine, the Church of Mary Magdalene herself, packed on her own feast day with Cathar and Catholic crammed in together. Terrified families pressed in among the pews and the cold pillars, listening to the screaming outside come closer and closer to the doors. The number for that one building, 7,000 dead, comes from Peter of Vaux-de-Cernay, a chronicler who admired the Crusaders and had no reason on earth to inflate their cruelty. Sanctuary meant nothing that day. The Crusaders came in over the threshold and killed everyone they could reach, the priests at the altar, the infants, the old men and women too slow to run, hacking through them in the dark and the smoke and the noise until the floor was a sheet of blood and there was nobody left upright. And then they fired the roof and let the building come down on what was inside it. They burned the whole city. The great cathedral of Saint-Nazaire, a Romanesque pile with a nave nearly as tall as Notre Dame in Paris, a building people had given their whole lives' labor to raise, was packed with townsfolk who'd run inside for the same reason they ran into the Madeleine, and the fire took it. The heat built until the stone itself cracked, and the roof and the upper walls came down all at once, burying the crowd underneath it, crushing the ones the flames hadn't reached yet, and the few who weren't crushed cooked under the rubble in the dark. The town burned so completely that the Crusaders, who'd been counting on a fat afternoon of looting once the killing was done, came up empty and furious, because the fire ate the plunder along with the people. Their own greed got cheated by their own savagery. The smoke from Béziers would have stood up over that flat country for a very long way, a black column on a hot summer afternoon. And every town within sight of it understood exactly what it meant. Now, the 20,000. The number does not hold up, and I don't tell you that to soften a single thing about what happened. Béziers couldn't physically have held 20,000 people inside its walls. Its actual population was probably under 15,000 at the very most. And that's the figure from the first reliable census more than a century later. The Church of the Madeleine, the one where 7,000 supposedly died, simply isn't a big enough building to have held 7,000 living human beings standing shoulder to shoulder, let alone to have seen them all individually killed inside it. So the historians who've gone through this very carefully, people like Christopher Tyerman and Lawrence Marvin, will tell you that most of the town's population almost certainly survived, that a great many fled out the far gates and scattered into the countryside before the ring closed, that Béziers was rebuilt and went on being a functioning town and a real population centre afterward. The killing was real and it was monstrous, but that round, biblical-sounding number of 20,000 is the legate boasting to the Pope about the scale of God's vengeance, not an actual count of the dead. And knowing all that doesn't make it gentler, not for me anyway. Whether it was 3,000 who died that day or 7,000 or some larger figure now lost forever, the people in the Madeleine were still burned alive at the altar on a feast day. The town still gathered in its cathedral and chose, openly and together, to die rather than hand over their neighbours to the fire, and a great many of them got exactly the death they'd voted for. And the terror did precisely what terror is built to do. Word of what had happened at Béziers spread across the Languedoc like a grass fire running ahead of the wind. Towns that heard the news started surrendering before the army even came into view on the horizon. Carcassonne fell within the month, in the middle of August, and its people were turned out of their own gates with absolutely nothing, in their undershirts according to one chronicler, stark naked according to another, walking out of the city they'd been born in with their hands completely empty, alive but ruined. The young Viscount, Raymond Roger Trencavel, the one who'd stood before the people of Béziers and promised to come back for them, never did. He was taken at Carcassonne and died in captivity before the year was out, in his own dungeon, only 24 years old. The cause never quite clear. His lands were handed over to one of the Crusades' commanders, a hard, brilliant, utterly pitiless soldier named Simon de Montfort, who would spend the entire rest of his life prosecuting this war up and down the south, town by town, fire by fire. He was a minor lord with a small inheritance and an enormous appetite, and the crusade made him. He took the conquered Trinquevel lands as his own, fought for them year after year against a population that never stopped resisting him, and was eventually killed under the walls of Toulouse in 1218 when a stone, thrown, the chroniclers delight in telling us, by the women working a siege engine on the walls, struck him in the head and killed him on the spot. The South remembered who threw it for centuries afterward. There's a small Hebrew chronicle that records the Jewish dead of Béziers at around 200, and that calls the year of 1209 simply the year of sorrow. 200 names out of one town, gone in an afternoon, and that's only counting one community within the walls. The chronicle doesn't try to total up the rest. It just marks the year and moves on, the way people do when the grief is too large to itemize. And the survivors who'd fled out the gates ahead of the fire, the weavers and the merchants and the families who'd voted in the cathedral to stand together, scattered out into a countryside that was about to learn what was coming for it next, carrying the news on foot, the first refugees of a war that would produce them by the tens of thousands. And it kept going. This thing that opened at Béziers for 20 years. At Minerve the very next year, 140 perfecti who refused to recant their faith were burned together, and the chroniclers note that many of them ran toward the fire of their own accord, rather than wait to be thrown in, which says a great deal about the conviction the army was trying to burn out of the South, and how badly it was failing even as it won. At Lavaux the year after, hundreds more went into the flames, and the lady who held the town, Giraud, was thrown down a well and stoned to death on top of it, buried under the stones her own people were forced to throw. The war ground on through the mountains and the river valleys until it reached a fortress called Massacres, perched up on a crag of rock with the clouds below it, where in the spring of 1244, the last great gathered community of Cathars made its final stand. The siege of it lasted nearly 10 months, the Crusaders unable to take the place by storm because of where it sat, until at last they got men up onto the heights by night, and the defenders knew it was over. They were given a truce of 15 days before the surrender, and in those 15 days something happened that's hard to fully take in. More than 20 of the ordinary fighting defenders, men who'd been promised their lives if they recanted, chose instead to receive the consolamentum in those final days and become perfecti themselves, knowing with complete certainty what it meant. They walked into the fire on purpose, having had 2 weeks to think about it. When the place finally fell, somewhere between 210 and 215 of them, the perfecti and those who'd chosen to receive the consolamentum in the last days, knowing exactly what it would cost them, walked down off the mountain into a wooden palisade that had been built at its foot and packed with brushwood, and they were burned all together in one enormous fire at a spot the locals still call the Prat dels Cremats, the field of the burned. A poet who wrote about the whole crusade left a verdict on it that I find myself thinking about more than I'd like, that if killing women and slitting children's throats and damning souls and sanctioning murder is really how a man wins Jesus Christ in this world, then Simon de Montfort surely must wear a crown and shine in heaven for it. The poet did not mean that as a compliment. The culture of the South never really recovered from any of it. The language faded under the long weight of the North. The county of Toulouse was eventually swallowed whole by the French crown. The Inquisition, brand new, was set up specifically to hunt down what the army had left, and it was thorough and patient, and it worked. And by around the middle of the next century, the Cathars were simply gone, erased from the world, and the whole 20-year machine of it had been set in motion by a man thrown off a bridge and a mob of barefoot servants who didn't wait to be told. Let me carry you back another 110 years now, and a couple of thousand miles to the east, because the crusade against the Cathars was not the first time a Christian army turned a city into a slaughterhouse and called it the will of God. The founding horror, the one the soldiers at Béziers would have grown up hearing about as the most glorious thing their grandfathers ever did, happened at Jerusalem. The 15th of July, 1099. The men who took Jerusalem that summer had been through something close to hell to even get there, and I mean that almost literally. The First Crusade had set out from Europe years earlier, tens of thousands of people of every kind, knights and peasants and priests and women and children, an enormous migrating mass. And the road had eaten most of them alive. They'd starved outside Antioch through a brutal winter. At a town called Massacre, by several contemporary accounts, the Crusaders had been so far gone with hunger, so deep into starvation, that they cut flesh from the bodies of the dead and ate it. And some of the chroniclers report this not with horror, but almost with a kind of grim pride. One of them writing that the men cut the buttocks of the dead and cooked them and ate them, and that the army was not ashamed. 3 years of that. 3 years of dysentery and fever and starvation and battle thinning the great host down, of women and children and old pilgrims dying along the roadside in the mountains of Anatolia, of the bones of the dead marking the route behind them like signposts. By the time the survivors finally crawled up to the walls of Jerusalem in June of 1099, the great army that had left Europe was a ragged, sunburned, half-starved remnant, maybe 1,300 mounted knights and 12,000 foot soldiers, dehydrated, exhausted, and absolutely on fire with faith, staring up at the holiest city in their entire world after 3 years of marching toward it through death. The city was held by the Fatimids of Egypt, and their governor, a man named Iftikhar al-Dawla, had prepared for exactly this arrival with cold competence. He poisoned the wells outside the walls so the Crusaders would have nothing to drink. He drove off all the livestock from the surrounding land so they'd have nothing to eat. He expelled the local Eastern Christians from inside the city because he didn't trust them not to open a gate to their co-religionists, which had happened before at Antioch. The walls were high, 18 meters in some places, 3 meters thick, and the Crusaders, dying of thirst in the savage July heat with no wood anywhere for siege towers because every single tree for miles around had already been cut down, threw themselves at the city once in mid-June in a wild, unprepared rush, and were thrown straight back off the walls with losses. What saved them, if that's even the word, was a fleet of Genoese ships landing down at the port of Jaffa, bringing timber and bringing skilled workmen who knew how to build. The Crusaders hauled the wood inland across the dry hills and built 2 enormous rolling siege towers and a battering ram, sweating and working in the full sun with their tongues swelling from thirst and water rationed to almost nothing. The thirst in those weeks was its own slow torture. The nearest reliable water was miles off, and the enemy patrolled the roads to it, so men paid wildly inflated prices for filthy water carried in stinking animal hides, and some drank from the mud and died of it, and the animals dropped dead in their lines and rotted where they fell, and made the camp a place of flies and sickness. These were men already hollowed out by years of starvation and disease on the road, and now they were building war engines in a furnace of heat with cracked lips and swollen tongues, kept upright by nothing but the conviction that the city in front of them was the literal dwelling place of God on earth. On the 8th of July, in a fit of penitential desperation, the entire army walked barefoot in solemn procession all the way around the walls of the city, the priests carrying the holy relics, chanting, while up on the battlements the defenders stood and watched and jeered at them, and by some accounts paraded crosses along the parapet and spat on them and made an open mocking show of insulting the Christian God in full view of the men below. That detail mattered enormously. The Crusaders stood there in the dust and the heat and watched their faith and their God ridiculed from the walls of the city they believed was the literal center of the world, and it fed something dark and patient in them that would come out a week later. The final assault came on the 14th and into the 15th of July. Godfrey of Bouillon got his great tower rolled up against the northern wall under a storm of arrows and stones and fire, and as the dawn broke on the 15th, the first men got across from the tower onto the battlements. A knight named Lethold was among the very first over the top. The defenders on that stretch broke and ran, and the Crusaders went after them down the stairs and into the streets. And they did not stop to take prisoners. They fought their way to a gate, threw it open from the inside, and the whole starving, sun-scorched, grief-hardened, insulted army poured into Jerusalem at once and fell on everything that breathed. They went house to house. They dragged families out into the street and cut them down on their own doorsteps. The men first, then the women, then the children, and where they found people hiding, they killed them where they crouched. They speared infants. They smashed heads against the walls. Old men who couldn't run were hacked apart in their beds. The killing rolled through the city all that day and into the night, and did not burn itself out for a long time, because there was always one more street, one more cellar, one more family pressed into a corner waiting for it. The men who were physically standing in the middle of it wrote it down, and 800 years later it still turns the stomach. Raymond of Aguilera, a chaplain who was actually there, described the killing at the Temple Mount, near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the place the Crusaders called the Temple of Solomon, where the last of the defenders and a huge crowd of civilians had crammed themselves in to hide. He wrote that if he told the truth about it, it would exceed your power to believe, and then he told it. In the temple and the porch of Solomon, he wrote, men rode in blood up to their knees and up to the very bridle reins of their horses. blood to the bridles. He described severed heads and hands and feet heaped up in the houses and lying out in the streets, men and horses wading through it, the killers themselves drenched red to the shoulder and beyond recognition, slipping on entrails as they worked. People who'd packed into the mosque for safety were butchered against each other so tightly that the dead couldn't fall, held upright by the press of the dying, and the crusaders climbed over the mounting bodies to reach the ones still moving at the back. That image of blood rising to the horses' bridles, the historians will tell you, Raymond lifted almost word for word out of the book of Revelation, where blood pours from the great winepress of the wrath of God as high as a horse's bridle. He wasn't down on his knees measuring it. He was reaching for scripture, for the language of the apocalypse, because what he'd watched felt to him like the end of the world arriving in person. So no, the streets weren't literally a knee-deep river you could drown in. A scholar named Thomas Madden worked through the grim arithmetic of how much blood that many opened bodies even hold and where it would run. And still, a man does not grab for the imagery of the end of all things unless he has just stood ankle-deep in something that burned through every ordinary word he had. The other eyewitness account, the one we call the Gesta Francorum, written by an anonymous ordinary soldier rather than a priest, is plainer in its language and somehow much worse for it. He says the slaughter at the Temple of Solomon was so heavy that the Crusaders sloshed through blood up to their ankles. And then he describes the cleanup, which is the part that genuinely stays with me. By the second and third day, the dead were rotting where they'd fallen, swelling and splitting in the July heat, the whole city one open grave reeking so badly that men gagged in the streets. So the handful of Muslims who'd been kept alive were put to work hauling the corpses of their own families and neighbors out through the gates, bodies coming apart in their hands as they dragged them and stacking them in heaps as tall as houses and burning them. Towering pyres of human beings shaped like pyramids, greasy black smoke standing up over the holy city for days, the fat of the dead running down into the dirt. The men who built those pyres were killed afterward too, once there was no one left to clear away. Fulcher of Chartres, who wasn't there himself but talked at length to men who were, says about 10,000 were killed in the temple area alone, and that anyone walking through afterward would have had their feet stained red to the ankle with the blood of the slain, picking their way over arms and legs and opened torsos to cross a room. He tells us, almost in passing, why they did it. They wanted to cleanse the place, he says, to scour out the contamination of the people who'd been living there. That was the logic underneath all of it. Greed was loose in those streets too, plenty of it. But beneath the greed sat a real belief that the city itself had been made filthy by the wrong people praying the wrong way in it for too long, and that it had to be scrubbed clean with their blood before it could be holy again. One moment inside the killing captures the whole character of it. A group of Muslim defenders had surrendered to Tancred, one of the senior Crusader leaders, and Tancred had taken their surrender and handed them his own personal banner to fly over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a recognized sign that these people were under his protection and not to be touched. He'd done the same at Bethlehem, and it had held. So the defenders gathered under his flag and waited there, believing they were safe, that the rules still meant something. The next morning, While Tancred was somewhere else in the city, other crusaders broke in and killed every last one of them, men, women, and children together, throats and skulls, under a banner that meant nothing once its owner had walked away. And then, with the floor heaped with the dead, the soldiers went down the bodies one by one with their knives and slit every belly open, sawing through the gut, hauling out the steaming insides by the fistful and pouring through them, because a rumor had gone round that these people had swallowed their gold coins to hide them, and the crusaders wanted that gold badly enough to go digging for it inside the corpses. They sat in the gore sorting coins out of intestines. Later, they burned a whole stack of the dead just to sift the melted gold out of the ash. The Jews of Jerusalem had fought side by side with the Muslims to defend the city, manning the walls together. And when the walls fell, they did what their community had done in catastrophe after catastrophe stretching back centuries. They gathered in their main synagogue to face the end together. According to a chronicler writing from Damascus, the crusaders barred the doors and put the building to the torch with the whole congregation trapped inside, and burned it down over their heads while they screamed, and some accounts have the soldiers standing in a ring around the blaze singing a Christian hymn, "Christ, we adore thee," as the people roasted alive in there. I'll be straight with you about the evidence because it matters to the people involved. A Jewish letter survives, written within about 2 weeks of the siege, the earliest account of the whole conquest in any language, that turned up in a storeroom of old documents in Cairo in the 20th century. It confirms the synagogue was destroyed, but it doesn't actually say the Jews were locked inside when it burned. And those same letters show that some Jews of Jerusalem were taken alive and later ransomed and bought free by their fellow Jews down the coast at Ascalon. So not every Jew in the city died that day, and the exact scene inside the synagogue is less certain than the most lurid version makes it. But the community was shattered beyond repair. The survivors were chained and dragged off to be sold or ransomed, and the long Jewish life of Jerusalem ended in that one afternoon. There's a detail in the sources that's somehow colder than all the talk of blood to the bridles, and it comes from Albert of Aachen, who wrote his account from the testimony of men who'd survived and come home. He records that the killing didn't end on the day of the storming, in the heat and the hysteria of breaking in. 3 days after the city had fallen, after the first fury had spent itself, the Crusaders went back and killed again, deliberately, in cold blood. They put to death a great number of captives they had spared on the first day, men and women they'd kept alive for ransom money or out of some flicker of human pity in the moment, and 3 days later, having thought it over, they cut their throats anyway. The chronicler Christopher Tyerman summed the whole thing up as a sustained massacre in the wild excitement of victory, followed 3 days later by a second round of cold-blooded mass killing, once everyone had calmed down enough to think clearly. The calm killing is the part that's hard to get past. The first day, you can almost understand as madness. The third day was a decision. Survivors definitely existed, even in a city emptied as thoroughly as this one. The governor who'd poisoned the wells, Iftikhar al-Dawla, had pulled his bodyguard back into the citadel by the Jaffa Gate, the strong point they called the Tower of David, and from there he bargained for his life. He bought it with the treasure he held and surrendered the tower to Raymond of Toulouse, and Raymond kept the bargain and had him and his men escorted safely out of the city to the coast at Ascalon, alive, while behind them the rest of Jerusalem died. So the man most responsible for the Crusaders' suffering outside the walls walked away under guard, and the ordinary people who'd had nothing to do with the wells were slaughtered in the streets. That's how these surrenders worked. The ones with treasure and a strong tower negotiated. Everyone else took whatever came through the gate. The numbers, as always with these things, run completely wild across the sources. The Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir, writing a full century later, said 70,000 people were killed in Al-Aqsa alone, which is simply more human beings than the entire city could conceivably have held inside its walls. Other medieval writers throw out 65,000 or 10,000, take your pick of the round numbers. A Muslim source much closer to the actual event, a man named Ibn al-Arabi, who had no earthly reason to make the Crusaders look better than they were, put the dead at around 3,000 out of a city of maybe 30,000. Modern historians end up landing somewhere across a very wide band, a few thousand at the cautious low end, perhaps as high as 40,000 at the upper end, given how badly the city had swollen with refugees fleeing in ahead of the Crusaders. One scholar in particular, Benjamin Kadar, went painstakingly through every source and concluded that the killing at Jerusalem was probably more thorough and more complete than at most other cities of that age that were taken by storm, precisely because there is so strikingly little evidence of survivors being enslaved or held for ransom afterward, compared to other sieges where the prisoner trade was brisk. The Crusaders at Jerusalem, by and large, were not in the business of taking prisoners. They were emptying the city of living human beings. The careful scholars add something alongside all of that, which is genuinely worth holding in your mind. By the savage standards of medieval siege warfare, a city that refused an offer to surrender and was then taken by storm was, in a brutal sense, expected to be sacked and put to the sword. That was the accepted law of war at the time, ugly as it is. So the reason Jerusalem echoed down through the centuries the way it did comes down mostly to the place itself. This was the city at the absolute center of the Christian and the Muslim and the Jewish worlds all at once, the navel of the earth as the maps of the time literally drew it. And it was drowned in blood by men who fully believed they were doing their God an enormous favor in the doing. Godfrey of Bouillon, when the killing had finally burned itself out, walked barefoot through the carnage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and knelt and wept and prayed over the empty tomb of his God, his hands and his feet still stained dark from the streets outside the door. He refused afterward to be crowned king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, taking instead the humbler title of protector or advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. He wept over the tomb of his Saviour in a city he had personally just helped fill with tens of thousands of corpses, and as far as anyone can tell from the record, he saw no contradiction in any of it whatsoever. The two things lived comfortably side by side in him. The memory of that single day never faded on the other side of it. It became a deep, lasting wound in Muslim memory that helped fuel the call to holy war for generations down the line. And when Saladin finally retook Jerusalem nearly 90 years later and pointedly let the great majority of the Christians simply ransom themselves and walk away alive, With their lives and often their freedom intact, people on every side notice the difference sharply. They are, frankly, still noticing it today. Godfrey himself didn't live long to enjoy the city he'd bled for. He was dead within a year of illness, and the crown he'd refused to wear in life was taken up by his brother Baldwin, who had no such scruples about gold and called himself King of Jerusalem outright. The great mosques the Crusaders had filled with bodies were scrubbed out and reconsecrated as churches. The Dome of the Rock became a Christian temple, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Temple of Solomon where the blood had supposedly run to the bridles, became in time the headquarters of the Knights Templar, who took their very name from it. Men prayed and slept and stored their weapons in the rooms where the killing had been thickest, and as far as we can tell, it didn't trouble their sleep. Let me move us forward now, out of the Holy Land and out of the burning south into a completely different kind of war, in a softer landscape. 270 years after Jerusalem, in the autumn of 1370, in the green rolling hills of central France, a dying man was carried in a litter toward a city that had betrayed him, and what he did when he arrived there has shadowed his name ever since. The man was Edward of Woodstock, the eldest son of the King of England, and history would come to know him as the Black Prince. In his prime, he had been the single most admired warrior in all of Europe, no exaggeration. He'd won his spurs at Crécy as a teenager, standing in the line while his father deliberately refused to send him help so the boy could earn the day himself. He'd captured the King of France with his own outnumbered army at Poitiers, and then, famously, served that captured king at table with his own hands as a courtesy, the perfect picture of chivalry. He was the flower of English knighthood, the living model of what a knight was supposed to be, brave and generous and gracious and merciful to his beaten enemies. And then his own body betrayed him, quietly, from the inside. After a campaign down in Spain in 1367, a campaign he actually won on the battlefield, he came home carrying a disease that would never once leave him for the rest of his life. The chroniclers say something terrible happened to his army on that Spanish campaign, that the great majority of his men, by one account as many as 4 in 5, died not in battle but of dysentery and fevers and sickness in the camps, and that only a fraction of the men who marched out ever made it back to English soil. The prince himself was among the stricken, and from that point onward his life becomes the long, slow, grinding story of one of the strongest men of his age, watching his own body fail him by inches, year after year. What exactly was wrong with him, nobody can say for certain even now. The old word for it was dysentery, the bloody flux that killed so many of his men in Spain. But some who've studied his decline doubt that, because the illness dragged on for nearly a decade and let him campaign again at least once, which a simple case of dysentery doesn't usually do. Malaria has been suggested, or some chronic wasting condition, or the lingering aftermath of an infection that never fully cleared. Whatever it was, it swelled his body and drained his strength, and left him, by the end, a man who had to be lifted and carried. By 1370, he could no longer even sit on a horse. He was carried everywhere he went, on a litter, like the sick man he was. While he was lying there, sick and weakening month by month, the French king Charles V, a patient and clever ruler, started systematically taking back the territory the English held in the south of France, in Aquitaine, and one town after another quietly opened its gates to the returning French without putting up any fight at all. The prince could do nothing but lie there and hear the reports come in, his life's work in France coming apart while he couldn't stand up. And then came Limoges. Limoges hurt, and it hurt specifically because of who it was that handed it over. The city's bishop, a man named Jean de Croce, was a personal friend of the prince. More than that, he was godfather to the prince's own young son. This was a man inside the prince's own circle of trust. And in August of 1370, this trusted friend opened the gates of his part of the city to the French and changed sides. One later account even says the bishop spread a rumor that the prince was already dead to help talk the frightened townsfolk into the switch. For a man already humiliated by his failing body and his crumbling territories, the betrayal by a close and trusted friend, a man who held his son at the baptismal font, appears to have been the precise thing that lit the fuse. I should be careful about the geography of Limoges because it genuinely changes the whole shape of the event. Limoges in 1370 was really two separate walled towns sitting right next to each other under one name. One was the Cité, the older ecclesiastical part clustered tightly around the cathedral, and that is the part the bishop controlled and handed to the French, and that is the part the prince attacked. The other was the Château, the larger commercial town built up around the Abbey of Saint-Martial, and that part actually stayed loyal to England and was never touched. So when we talk about the sack of Limoges, the bloody famous one, we are really talking about one walled ecclesiastical section of a divided city, not the whole place. That single fact has gotten lost for centuries under the weight of the story. The prince, who could barely move under his own power, pulled together an army of a few thousand men, somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 by most counts, a mix of men-at-arms and the famous English archers and infantry, and had himself carried the 100 miles or so from where he was lying to the gates of Limoges on his litter, the whole long way. With him rode two of his own brothers, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and Edmund of Langley, along with a collection of grizzled veteran captains who'd fought beside him for years. No long grinding siege came, no months of starving the place out. The English brought miners with them, and miners were the quiet terror of any walled town in that age. They dug a tunnel in under the foundations of the wall, propping the roof of the tunnel up with heavy timbers as they went deeper, and then, when the tunnel was far enough under the wall, they packed those timbers around with brushwood and kindling and set the whole thing on fire and pulled back. When the props burned through and gave way, the tunnel collapsed, and the great section of stone wall sitting directly on top of it collapsed down with it, sliding and crashing down into the ditch in a roar of dust and broken stone, leaving a wide breach open to the sky. The whole operation took only a handful of days. For the people inside the Cité, those days would have been their own kind of slow horror, the sound of digging somewhere under the walls, day and night, getting no clearer. No one able to say exactly where the tunnel was or when the wall would come down, only that it would. They had switched sides expecting the French to protect them, and the French had not come, and now the most feared soldier in Europe was lying in a litter outside their walls with miners working underneath them and nothing between. On the 19th of September, which happened to be the anniversary, almost to the day, of his great triumph at Poitiers years before. The wall of Limoges came down and the English stormed in through the breach. What happened inside the breached walls comes to us, above everything else, from one man, the chronicler Jean Froissart, and his version is the one that branded the prince a butcher for the next 600 years. Froissart wrote that the prince, inflamed with anger and burning for revenge, was carried into the captured city in his litter and gave the order to put it to the sack. The English came through the breach and went to work on a town that had no garrison left to stop them, and what Froissart describes is methodical slaughter. Men, women and children threw themselves down on their knees in the dirt as the litter was carried past, clutching at it, screaming for mercy, and the prince looked through them and gave no sign and let it go on. Soldiers kicked in doors and hauled whole families out into the street by the hair and opened their throats over the gutters, the way you'd bleed a pig, leaving them kicking in the runoff. They cut down people running, people hiding, people on their knees praying. Froissart says there was no heart in the whole city so hard it didn't weep at what was happening, and that upwards of 3,000 men, women and children were butchered in a single day, dragged from their houses through the streets specifically to have their throats cut, the bodies left piling in the lanes. God have mercy on their souls, he wrote, for they were true martyrs. 3,000 people, throats opened in the streets, on the cold order of a dying man being carried past the kneeling and the begging in a litter, refusing even to look at them. That is the picture that fixed itself onto the name of Edward of Woodstock and never came off. But the evidence we actually have now is genuinely different from Froissart's terrible scene, and it's worth telling you about. For one thing, Froissart wrote his account decades after the fact, and by the time he wrote it he had moved on to working for a French patron, a count, and his source for the events at Limoges may well have been someone with no love at all for the prince. For another thing, there is a letter written by the Black Prince himself in his own name just 3 days after the city fell, sent to a fellow nobleman, that was discovered sitting in a Spanish archive by a French historian in recent years and only published quite recently. In that letter, the prince describes the assault, the breach made by the mining, the plunder of the captured town, and he reports killing around 100 French men-at-arms of the garrison and taking around 200 prisoners, including the bishop himself. He doesn't mention killing civilians at all, not one word about a massacre of the townspeople. A separate local chronicle, written at the Loyal Abbey in the other half of the city, says that more than 300 people were put to death, which is 1/10 of Froissart's number. And the part of Limoges that was actually sacked may have only had 2,000 or 3,000 people living in it in the first place, so Froissart's 3,000 dead would have meant the killing of essentially every living soul in the place, and that is plainly not what the other surviving records describe. So the modern picture that emerges is something more like 300 dead, maybe somewhat more, a mix of the garrison and a portion of the townsfolk in a city taken by storm following a personal betrayal. By the standards of the time, that is a sack, a genuinely ugly and violent sack, with real dead civilians in the streets. But Froissart's singular, monstrous 3,000 throats atrocity simply outruns what the records will bear, and history swallowed his version whole. A historian who's looked hard at this, Sean McGlynn, makes the point that what unsettled people about Limoges came down less to the count of the dead and more to the sight of a major town, a real urban centre, devastated so completely and so visibly, which didn't happen all that often even in a brutal age. Limoges was famous across Europe for its enamel work. Those brilliant blue and gold reliquaries and caskets that great churches everywhere prized, a craft that had made the city's name for generations. The sack broke that industry so badly it took roughly 100 years to recover. The prince's men carried off what they could of the city's wealth, the goldsmith's work and the silver, the way a stormed city was always stripped, and a craft tradition built up over lifetimes went into the saddlebags of soldiers in an afternoon. And one detail cuts against the legend hard. The prince captured the bishop, Jean de Croix, the old friend who had betrayed him, the man whose treachery had supposedly driven him into a blind killing rage, and he spared the man's life. He kept him prisoner, and the bishop was later released. That is not the behavior of a man so lost to fury that he was personally watching 3,000 innocents have their throats cut. And then, almost as soon as he had taken the place, the prince left it and turned for home. He went back a sick and broken man, and there, at Angoulême, he learned that his eldest son, a little boy of 6 years old, also named Edward, had died while his father was away at the war. The child he had hoped would carry his name and his blood forward was gone, and he hadn't been there. The prince's health collapsed completely after that double blow, the failing body and the dead son arriving together. He handed his command over to his brother John of Gaunt, sailed home across the Channel to England after Christmas, formally gave up his lands in France a couple of years later, and then lingered on as an invalid, slowly wasting, for a few more years before he finally died in 1376 at the age of just 45. He never became king. His father, old Edward III, outlived his greatest son by a single year. The crown passed over the dead prince entirely to his one surviving child, a 10-year-old boy who would grow up to become King Richard II and lose his throne, and very probably be murdered for it. But that is a whole other tragedy for another day. The name the Black Prince itself, the dark and famous name he's known by now, he was never once called that in his own lifetime. It only appears in the records more than a century and a half after he was already dead and buried. The grandest English warrior of his entire age went to his grave with his shining reputation already tangled up forever in the killing at Limoges, and the dark nickname attached itself afterward, almost as if later history quietly decided what it really thought of him and gave him a name to match. His tomb is still there in Canterbury Cathedral, where you can go and stand in front of it. And above it hang his actual things, his real helmet, his shield, his gauntlets, the genuine objects he wore in his life, darkened now with 600 years of age, the worn-out relics of a man who won absolutely everything while he was young and then spent his last years being carried helplessly from one place to another, while his body and his territories and his reputation all came apart in his hands at the same time. On the tomb itself, carved at his own request, runs a long verse in French about the vanity of earthly glory, a dead prince reminding whoever stands over him that he was once beautiful and rich and feared, and that now he is only this, bones under a cold effigy, and that the reader will come to the same end. He chose those words for himself. A man who had served kings at table and captured kings in the field, asking the people who'd come to gawk at his grave to remember mostly that none of it lasts. From a dying prince in the green French hills, let me turn you toward the very end of the entire crusading dream, to a city pressed up against the sea with nowhere left in the world to run. Acre, on the coast of what is now Israel, in the spring of 1291. This is the place where 2 full centuries of European crusading in the Holy Land finally, and very bloodily, came to its end. By the year 1290, Acre was the last great prize the Crusaders still held in the East. Jerusalem itself had been lost to Saladin 100 years before. The mighty Muslim sultans of Egypt, the Mamluks, slave soldiers who had risen to rule an empire, had spent the previous decades methodically swallowing the Crusader strongholds one after another, with a patient relentlessness that must have been terrifying to watch from inside the shrinking Christian territory. Antioch, gone, and its population massacred when it fell. Crac des Chevaliers, that vast, impregnable mountain castle, gone. Tripoli, gone. Acre was what remained, a rich and crowded and famously quarrelsome port city, jammed onto a peninsula and ringed by a double set of massive stone walls, studded with 12 great towers. Inside those walls lived a fractious, feuding mix of Italians from Venice and Genoa and Pisa, merchant communities who hated one another with a passion and occasionally fought open street battles, alongside the great military religious orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, who didn't have much warmth for each other either. It was a powder keg of a city, long before the enemy ever showed up at the gates. And the spark, as it so often is in these stories, was a massacre that the Crusaders themselves committed. In the summer of 1290, a band of rough, raw new Crusaders, fresh off the boats from Italy and looking for someone to fight, got drunk and rioted, and started killing Muslim merchants in the streets of Acre, traders who had come into the city peacefully to do business under the protection of a standing truce. The story goes that some of the killings started over almost nothing, a quarrel, a rumor, a wife, one small, ugly spark of the sort that sets a crowded city alight. By some accounts, they killed local Christian peasants too in the confusion, anyone whose beard or dress made them look the part of an enemy, men who'd come in from the countryside to sell their produce and ended up dead in the gutter for the crime of looking foreign to a drunk man with a knife. The Sultan, Kalawun, an old and formidable man who had spent his life dismantling the Crusader states piece by piece, demanded that the specific men responsible for the killings be handed over to face justice, which by the terms of the truce was an entirely reasonable demand. And the Council of Acre, with the Templar Grand Master William of Beaujeu among the voices advising them, refused. They would not hand over Christians to a Muslim court to be executed, even Christians who'd murdered men under truce. So the Sultan declared the truce formally broken and began to gather his enormous army. He died before he could march it north, but his son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, a young man of about 30, swore an oath to finish exactly what his father had started, and he meant every word of it. When the desperate city of Acre sent a peace delegation to him to try to talk their way out of it, Khalil threw the entire delegation into prison, and not one of those men ever came out alive again. The army Khalil brought down on Acre in the spring of 1291 was enormous, the medieval sources reaching for figures so large they can't be trusted, but vast by any honest reckoning. The defenders were pitifully, hopelessly few against it, maybe 600 or 700 actual knights, and perhaps 13,000 foot soldiers and armed townsmen, every man who could hold a weapon. The Mamluks brought with them a whole forest of siege engines, including giant catapults so large the army gave them individual names, because of course they did. A great one called the Victorious and another one called the Furious, hauled overland in heavy pieces all the way from Damascus and reassembled, plus a swarm of smaller, faster machines the soldiers called the Black Bulls. They had felled the cedar forests of Lebanon just to build them. The army arrived in early April and immediately set to work, beginning to pound the walls with stone day and night, while the miners began to dig in underneath them, the two oldest methods of bringing down a fortress working together. The defenders fought back with real, genuine, almost reckless courage in those first weeks, knowing how badly the numbers ran against them. There's a moonlit raid in the middle of April, where William of Beaujeu personally led the Templars out through the gates in the dark of night to strike the enemy camp by surprise and burn their engines. It went wrong almost immediately and horribly. In the pitch dark, the knights' war horses tangled their legs in the guy ropes and tent cords of the Mamluk camp and went crashing down, throwing their armored riders, and in the chaos 18 Templars were killed, cut down before they could get back up. One of them, in a detail that's almost too grim and too human to bear, fell in the darkness straight into a latrine pit, an open cesspit, and drowned in it, in the filth, unable to climb out in his armor. The King of Cyprus arrived in early May with reinforcements, 40 ships and a few hundred fresh men, and the morale inside the walls lifted for a single bright moment. But his attempt to open negotiations with the Sultan went absolutely nowhere, and the bombardment simply ground on, day after day after day. The great named catapults working steadily at the walls, the miners working steadily underneath them, the towers slowly coming apart stone by stone. There's a horrible patience to a siege like that for the people trapped inside it. You wake each morning to the same sound, the heavy thud of the stones striking the walls, the grind and scrape from somewhere below the foundations where you can't see, and you know that the wall protecting you and your children is a little thinner than it was yesterday, and that nothing you do will stop tomorrow from coming. The catapults threw stones and they threw fire, pots of burning naphtha that splashed and stuck and burned, and they threw, by some accounts, the severed heads of prisoners back over the walls to remind the defenders exactly what waited for them. The defenders answered with their own engines and their own sorties and their own dwindling courage, and the Sultan's army only grew, fed and resupplied from a whole empire at its back, while inside the walls the food and the arrows and the hope all ran lower together. By the middle of May, The towers were crumbling and falling. The collapse of the King's Tower in particular broke something deep in the city's spirit, because everyone could see it go. A great mass of the city's strength simply sliding into the ditch in a cloud of dust. King Henry of Cyprus, who held the title King of Jerusalem too, a young man and reportedly an epileptic, did what he could and then, with the city clearly lost, took ship back to Cyprus, and the people he left behind never forgave him for it, fair or not. And before dawn on the 18th of May, the Mamluks launched everything they had at the walls all at once, advancing to a wall of sound designed to terrify, drums and crashing cymbals and screaming trumpets. The noise of the kettle drums carried into battle on the backs of 300 camels, a sound meant to break the defenders' nerve as much as to signal the charge. The defenders up on the walls poured arrows and crossbow bolts down into the oncoming human mass, tearing holes in it, and the ordinary townspeople up on the rooftops hurled stones down with their bare hands. Women and old men and children carrying rocks up the stairs to drop on the soldiers below, doing what little they could to a thing that could not be stopped. Too many attackers came, wave after wave after wave, climbing up over the bodies of their own dead to reach the top, and at last the line broke. The Mamluks took the great tower they called the Accursed Tower, and from there they pushed the defenders back, street by street, toward the gate of St. Anthony. And it is right here, at the breach, in the press of that retreat, that William of Beaujeu died, in a way the chroniclers recorded carefully because of what he said as he did. He was an old man by this point, well past the age for fighting in a wall breach, and he had thrown his armour on in a great hurry when the alarm came, and in the rush, a section of plate under his raised left arm had been left unsecured and open. A spear, or by some accounts an arrow, drove into him there, into the unprotected armpit, finding the one gap in the steel. He turned, hurt, to make his way back out of the fighting, and his own men saw him going and cried out after him in something close to panic, begging him not to abandon them, not to leave them there to die without their leader. And the old Grand Master answered them. "I am not fleeing," he said. "I am dead. Look at the wound." And he lifted his arm and showed them the shaft buried in his side. 2 of his knights laid him down on a shield and carried him back through the dying, burning city to the temple, the Templar fortress, and there, behind its walls, he died of the wound. And when he fell, the last real coordinated resistance in Acre fell along with him. After that came the butchery and the panic right alongside it. The Mamluks flooded into the streets in numbers no one could stop, and they killed as they came, working through the city quarter by quarter. They cut down anyone in front of them, fighters and merchants and women with children in their arms, and the gutters of Acre ran down toward the harbour carrying the blood with them. Severed heads were stacked at the corners. Bodies choked the narrow lanes until men had to climb over them. The entire surviving population ran for the water because the open sea was the only road left out of a world that was ending around them. And there were not nearly enough ships. The wealthy offered absolute fortunes for a single place on a boat. People clawed and trampled each other on the docks to reach the water's edge, the strong shoving the weak off the stone lip into the sea to drown. And there were men ready to profit from exactly that. Some of the ship captains in the harbor, with the city burning behind them, charged the panicking refugees everything they had for a place on board, stripping them of their last coins and rings before letting them climb in. And some accounts say a few simply took the money and the jewels, and then shoved the people back off into the water once the purse was empty, watching them sink. A storm blew up over those last days, lashing the overloaded boats as they tried to claw out of the harbor, so that some who'd paid everything for a deck were drowned anyway, a mile out when the sea rolled the boat under, paid in full for a passage straight to the bottom. The Hospitaller Grand Master, badly wounded, was carried by his men down to a ship and got away. The King of Cyprus got away. But for most of the people crowding the harbor that day, there was no room and no boat coming. In one scene the chroniclers preserved the Patriarch of Jerusalem, an old man being rowed out towards safety, kept letting drowning swimmers haul themselves up over the sides out of pity, unable to turn them away, until there were too many bodies aboard, and the little boat simply rolled and tipped every soul in it into the sea. And the old man went down with the people he'd been trying to save. Those who couldn't reach a ship at all were hacked down where they stood on the harbour stones, or chained together and dragged off toward the slave markets, the women and the children and the old, sold off into the rest of their lives. One single pocket of the city held out after everything else had fallen. The Templar fortress, set in the corner of Acre with its back hard against the sea, the strongest building in the whole place, and into it had crowded more than 1,000 people. The surviving fighters and ordinary civilians together, everyone who had managed to fight or run their way to its gates. It held on for 10 more days after the rest of Acre had already fallen and been given over to the killing. In the dead of one night, a Templar named Thibaut Gaudin slipped quietly out of the fortress by ship and carried the Order's treasure away up the coast to safety. And then the Templars who remained inside opened negotiations. Their commander, Peter de Sévry, struck a deal with the Sultan himself, terms for surrender, safe passage by ship to Cyprus for every single person sheltering inside the fortress, fighters and civilians alike. The Sultan, Khalil, agreed to the terms, and he sent a few hundred of his own soldiers into the fortress to oversee the orderly evacuation of the people, and they raised the Sultan's banner up over the building to show it was now under his protection. And then those soldiers, once they were inside the fortress and among the packed and frightened refugees, began to assault the women and the young boys sheltering there. The Templars, watching this happen to the very people they had just bargained to protect under their own roof, lost every shred of restraint they had left. They slammed the gates shut, killed every one of the Sultan's men now trapped inside with them, tore the Sultan's banner back down off the walls, and ran their own black and white war banner, the Béziers, back up to the top, and resolved, all of them together, to die exactly where they stood, rather than trust another word from the man outside. The next morning the Sultan called the commander out once more to talk and to renew the terms, promising him safe conduct, and when Peter de Sévry and a handful of his knights came out under that promise to negotiate, they were seized and beheaded on the spot, in full and deliberate view of their brothers watching helplessly down from the walls. So the last Templars left in Acre made their peace with dying. and the Mamluk miners went to work digging in under their fortress exactly the way they had dug under the outer walls of the city. On the 28th of May, they finished the tunnel and burned out the props, and the Sultan immediately threw a storming party of some 2,000 men rushing in toward the breach to finish it. And the sheer weight of all those armored men pouring in at once onto a great stone structure already undermined and weakened and burned out from below was too much for it. The whole fortress came down. It fell all at once in a single thunderous avalanche of stone, floor crashing onto floor, and it crushed everyone underneath it. The last Templars inside and the 2,000 Mamluks storming in, pulped together under thousands of tons of masonry in the same instant. Men were flattened mid-swing, snapped in half, buried alive in pockets of the rubble to suffocate slowly in the dark with the dead packed around them. Defenders and attackers, Christian and Muslim, besieged and besieger, all ground into the same heap of broken stone and broken bodies, indistinguishable, the dust of it hanging over the harbour for hours. That was the end of Acre. The Sultan rode in triumph back to Damascus afterward, with his Christian prisoners chained and stumbling behind him, and the captured Crusader banners carried deliberately upside down to display their disgrace to the watching crowds. The road before him strewn with fine satin for his horse to walk on, 280 fettered captives paraded along in front of him while the entire population of the city turned out into the streets to watch the procession of the man who had finished the holy war. The gate of one of Acre's churches was carried all the way to Cairo to be built into a mosque there, a trophy of stone, the doorway of a Christian church, becoming the doorway of a Muslim one 1,000 miles away. The captives who survived the march were scattered into slavery across the Mamluk world, and some of them were still being ransomed home decades later. Old men by then, freed at last into a Europe that had half forgotten the city they'd been taken from. He gave orders that the walls of Acre be torn down to the ground, that its harbour be wrecked and choked, and that the orchards and irrigated fields all around it be systematically destroyed, so that no future crusade could ever land there and use the place as a foothold again. The rest of the Crusader towns along the coast gave up within months without a real fight, Tyre and Sidon and Beirut, and the very last Crusader castle on the coast was simply abandoned, its garrison sailing away in the August of that same year. The Crusader kingdom that had been founded in the blood of Jerusalem back in 1099 ended in the blood of Acre in 1291, almost exactly the span of one long human lifetime, from its violent beginning to its violent end. And there is one last bitter coda to all of it: the Templars, who had fought to the very last man at Acre, who had pulled down a sultan's banner rather than stand by while their refugees were defiled, who died under a collapsing tower with their enemies, would within barely 20 years be blamed for the loss of the Holy Land entirely, arrested in a single coordinated dawn across France, tortured into confessions, and destroyed root and branch by their own Christian king and their own pope. The men who held out the longest and died the hardest got remembered the worst of anyone. And the man who finished them, the young Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, who had sworn to complete his father's work and had done exactly that before he was 35, didn't enjoy his triumph for very long either. Within 3 years, he was murdered by his own emirs, his own commanders, in a conspiracy at his own court, cut down on a hunting trip by the men closest to him. The conqueror of Acre, the man who ended 200 years of crusading in a single spring, outlived his greatest victory by barely 3 years and died by treachery, the same way so many of the men in these stories did. Now let me bring you somewhere colder and quieter and, in its own slow way, even more terrible than any of it, because the killing I want to end on did not happen with swords flashing in a burning street over a couple of frantic hours. It happened slowly, deliberately, across an entire long winter, by fire and then by hunger, spread out over a wide green country in the north of England. The harrying of the north, the winter of 1069 turning into 1070, and the man who ordered it done was William the Conqueror. 3 years on from his great victory at the Battle of Hastings, William's actual grip on England was still a long way from secure, and the north of the country was by far the worst of his problems. York and Durham and the old lands up there were a genuinely different place, far more Scandinavian than English in their blood and their loyalties and their memory, and they simply did not consider themselves conquered just because some Norman duke had won a single battle hundreds of miles away to the south. In the autumn of 1069, the whole north rose against him in earnest. The last surviving English claimant to the throne, Edgar the Aetheling, joining forces with a large Danish fleet that had sailed up the eastern coast hungry for plunder and a crown, and together they took the city of York and slaughtered the Norman garrison holding it. Hundreds of men cut down in the streets and at the castle. It was the most serious threat to William's rule since the day of Hastings itself, and he knew it. He had spent 3 years building castles across the country and crushing smaller revolts, but this was different. This was the whole north of his new kingdom rising at once with a foreign army at its back and a rival claimant at its head. If it held, he could lose everything he'd won at Hastings. So he moved north fast, and the first thing he did was the coldest and the cleverest. He paid the Danes to leave, simply bought them off with silver, sent the fleet home, and stripped the rebellion of its teeth before he'd fought a single battle. And then, with the Danes gone and the English rebels left alone and exposed, he turned to the question of how to make sure this never happened again. His response to it is one of the coldest, most calculated decisions any English king has ever made. He couldn't catch the rebels in an open battle because they wouldn't give him one. They faded away into the hills and the dales whenever his army came near and reappeared behind him when it had passed. So he settled on a different solution entirely. If he could not kill the rebels themselves, he would kill the country that fed them. He spent Christmas of 1069 in the ruins of York, and then, in the absolute dead of the northern winter, the worst possible time of year to be turned out of your home, he gave the order and turned his soldiers loose across the land. They went out in raiding parties across more than 100 miles of countryside, fanning out, riding as far north as the River Tyne. And they burned everything. The villages first, every house and barn and hall. They burned the crops still sitting in the storehouses, the harvest that had just come in. They burned the seed grain, the seed corn that the entire next year's planting and the whole next harvest absolutely depended on. They burned the food that families had carefully laid in to carry themselves through the winter months. They slaughtered the livestock, all of it, the cattle and the sheep and the pigs and the oxen that pulled the heavy plows, and left the carcasses to rot in the fields rather than let anyone eat them. They burned the plows themselves and the farming tools, the very means of ever growing food again. And they did all of it in the depths of winter on purpose, with deliberate cold intent. Because in winter there is nothing at all growing out in the fields to fall back on, and a family whose stored food and whose seed grain and whose animals have all been burned to ash in January has no possible way to feed itself and no possible way to grow anything more, and knows it, sitting in the cold ashes of its home with 3 or 4 months of hard winter still stretching out ahead of it and nothing left. The killing and the harrying was not mostly done by the sword at all. The sword only started it. Hunger did the rest, the great majority of it, slowly, over the following weeks and months. Burning the food of an enemy was not, in itself, some unheard-of horror in the 11th century. Commanders had always known that the surest way to break a region was to starve it, and the old Roman writer Vegetius, whose military handbook men like William's clerks would have known, said flatly that the chief art of war was to destroy your enemy by famine. What set the harrying apart, what made even William's own admirers recoil from it, was the cold completeness of it, a whole settled country full of farmers and children stripped bare in the worst month of the year, the land itself emptied of people rather than an army merely starved off a siege line. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, a monk who was himself half English by birth and wrote about all this some 50 years afterward, condemned William for the harrying in language he did not use for anything else the man ever did in a long and violent reign. He wrote that the king cut down many people and destroyed their homes and their land, that nowhere else had William ever shown such cruelty, that to his lasting shame he made no effort whatsoever to control his fury, and punished the wholly innocent right along with the guilty. He ordered the crops and the herds and the tools and the food all burned to ashes together, Orderic says. And as a direct result, more than 100,000 people perished of starvation. And then Orderic, who had spent a great deal of his enormous history praising William as a strong and able and God-favored ruler, wrote that on this one subject he could say nothing good at all, that this had been a brutal and indefensible slaughter, and that God himself would surely punish the king for having done it. 100,000. We'll come back round to that number in a moment. But first sit with what starvation across a whole region in the dead of winter actually did to bodies, because the chroniclers didn't spare us, and they weren't the sort of men to invent it. Starvation isn't quick. It hollows you out over weeks. The fat goes first, then the muscle, the body eating itself from the inside, the belly swelling even as the limbs go to sticks. The skin drawing tight over the skull until the living start to look like the dead they're lying next to. Children go silent. The cold finishes what the hunger starts. John of Worcester wrote that it got so bad that people, out of their minds with hunger, ate human flesh, carved meat off the corpses lying in the lanes and cooked it, ate horses and dogs and cats, ate anything that had ever had meat on it, and then ate the dead when there was nothing else. A parent did that, decided to do that, in a frozen house full of bodies. And he wrote that others, to keep from coming to that, sold themselves, walked up to whoever had food, and handed over their own freedom and their children's freedom forever, made themselves slaves for life in exchange for being fed. Think about what that takes. To stand in front of a stranger and say, "Own me, own my body and my labor and my children. Do whatever you want with all of us until we die. Only put something in our mouths today." People did that by the thousand across the north of England in one winter, because the other thing in front of them was watching their kids waste away to nothing on the floor. Simeon of Durham, writing of the aftermath, said that between the city of York and the city of Durham there was not one single inhabited village left standing, not one across all that distance. The land lay completely empty and uncultivated for 9 full years afterward, he says, the houses standing open and rotting where they hadn't been burned, the fields growing back wild to weeds and scrub. The few scattered survivors fled away south as starving refugees, choking the roads, turning up at the gates of monasteries in places like Evesham far to the south, begging for bread, and dying anyway in the doorways and the ditches when there wasn't enough to give them. The monks at Evesham wrote of bodies in the lanes around the abbey, of the dead and the half-dead arriving faster than anyone could bury or feed them, the famine walking south on the legs of the people fleeing it. The chronicles carry reports too grim almost to repeat, of travellers finding whole families dead together in their cold houses, and of the roads north lined with the unburied because there was no one left with the strength to dig. A whole region of England emptied out of its people, and the handful who managed to get out alive carried the famine and the dying south along the roads with them. The single most haunting piece of evidence for all of it, though, isn't in any of the chronicles at all. It's in a tax record. 17 years after that terrible winter, William ordered a vast and famous survey made of his entire kingdom, the Domesday Book, a cold, methodical accounting of every manor and village and estate, who held it, what it contained, and what it was worth in money. And when the king's surveyors worked their way up into Yorkshire and the north, page after page after page comes back to us with a single flat Latin word written in next to the manor's name: Worcester. Waste. It is waste. Manor after manor, village after village, holding after holding, just that one bleak word repeating down the columns of the page: waste, 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 in the dry hand of a royal clerk who had no reason to dramatize anything and was only recording what the commissioners told him. The scholars who have studied those Yorkshire pages closely estimate that even 16 years on from the harrying, the county may still have held only about a quarter of the people and a quarter of the working plough teams it had held before William came, that perhaps 150,000 fewer human beings lived there than had lived there on the day the old English king died in his bed. By that same accounting, something like 6 in 10 of all the holdings in Yorkshire were still recorded as waste 16 years later, and 2/3 of all the villages contained at least some land marked that way, and even the parts of the county that had recovered had lost most of their value compared to what they'd been worth before. Northumberland, further north still, wasn't even considered worth the trouble of surveying properly at all. The clerks left great stretches of it simply blank white space on the page where a county used to be. and here and there, beside the Yorkshire manors marked waste, the survey records the name of the man who had held the land before in King Edward's day, and then nothing at all for who held it now, because there was no longer anyone there to hold it, the line simply running out into emptiness the way the land itself had. A whole settled human geography of names and households and ploughed fields, reduced to a column of one repeated word in a clerk's ledger, the most bureaucratic possible record of one of the most savage things ever done on English soil. Now, that number, the 100,000 dead that Orderic handed down to us, the historians do treat it with real caution, the same careful way they treat the 20,000 at Béziers and the 70,000 at Jerusalem. It might well be too high. It would mean killing something like a quarter or a third of every living person in the whole north of England, and some scholars doubt William even had the manpower to physically wreck so vast an area quite so completely in a single winter. And there's a genuine, ongoing debate among historians about what that recurring word waste even truly meant to the men who wrote it in the tax book. Whether it meant the land had been physically destroyed and its people were actually dead, or whether it just meant that no tax revenue was currently flowing in from that holding for some reason, which is not quite the same grim thing. Some historians will tell you the famine was absolutely real but considerably more local and patchy than the chronicler's sweeping language made it sound. Others have gone firmly the other way and called the harrying of the North an outright act of genocide. The argument is still live. What is genuinely not in any doubt at all is that it worked completely and permanently. The north of England produced no more serious rebellions, not for generations. William had solved the political problem of a rebellious region by the simple, brutal expedient of removing that region's physical capacity to sustain rebels or much of anyone else. The emptied land was carved up and handed out to new Norman lords loyal to the king, and it took decades and decades of slow effort to coax people and ploughs and crops back onto it, and the deep economic scars of that one winter were still plainly visible in the tax rolls a full generation later, written there in that one repeated word. And Orderic gives us one final scene to close on, set on William's own deathbed in the year 1087, 17 years after the harrying, when the old conqueror lay dying in agony in Normandy. And I'll tell you very plainly that historians strongly suspect Orderic put these particular words into the dying king's mouth himself, composed them as a kind of moral reckoning delivered through his subject, rather than recording anything William actually whispered with his last breaths. But it stands all the same as the verdict that his own century, his own people, reached on him. Orderic has the dying William confess that he had persecuted the native English people far beyond all reason, that he had fallen upon the people of the northern shires like a ravening, starving lion. He has him confess that he had ordered their houses and their grain and their tools and their cattle all burned together without distinction, and that by doing this he had taken his revenge on a vast multitude of men and women by deliberately subjecting them to the slow calamity of a cruel famine, and so had made himself the barbarous murderer of many thousands of that fine race of people, the young and the old alike. And then Orderic has him say that having seized the throne of that kingdom by so very many crimes, he now dared not leave it to anyone at all, but only to God, and let God dispose of it. Whether the real William ever actually said one word of that, whether he felt a single genuine moment of remorse on his deathbed for the long winter he had spent burning the North and starving its people, we simply cannot know, and we almost certainly never will. The man kept his own hard counsel right to the end, but the empty, silent villages were real. The 9 years of wild, untended fields were real. The people who sold themselves and their children into slavery for the price of one meal were real. And the word waste, written out over and over and over again down the long pages of his own textbook in the careful hand of his own royal clerks, is as real and as solid as anything else in the whole of English history. He had asked his conquered kingdom what it was worth to him, manor by manor, and across the entire north of it. The answer that kept coming back again and again, line after line, was nothing. It is waste. That's where I'll leave you this time. Thank you for staying with me all the way through it, through the burning churches and the drowned old men in their little boats, and that long, cold, silent winter up in the north of England. I know it's heavy material, and I don't ever take for granted that you choose to spend time sitting here in the dark with me, listening to it. Until then, take care.